First of all, they have to know where the bomb shelters are. If they will not stop the war, they will need it. In any case, wow. I mean, those are the stark words from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky back in April 2025. And this wasn't, some standard press conference clip. This threat, aimed right at the Russian leadership, was delivered from a cold, cramped school bomb shelter in his hometown, right after a Russian missile strike killed 19 people there, 9 children among them. Welcome to the Nation Scope podcast. Join Jordan and Jamie as they dive deep into the latest headlines, breaking stories, and critical events shaping America and the world. We analyze the news that matters most. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the source material around that really visceral moment, that bomb shelter ultimatum. Our mission, to unpack how this threat was, well, a pretty calculated strategic move, aimed not just at Moscow, but also maybe at the new U.S. administration and its own big peace plan. Stay with us as we connect this incredibly personal statement to the bigger diplomatic chessboard.
Yeah, that moment, from that specific place, it instantly became this huge focal point for understanding a new kind of coercive diplomacy. What's really fascinating when you dig into it is how carefully constructed the whole thing was. The visuals, the words, all designed for maximum psychological punch.
Okay, let's get into that. Our source material calls it a masterclass in strategic communication.
So it's not just what he said, but the where seems just as important, right? The bomb shelter setting. Why was that so critical?
Well, it's all about flipping the script, isn't it? Morally.
Yeah.
And in averting the reality on the ground. By speaking from that shelter, Zelensky wasn't some distant leader in a fan-fed office.
Yeah.
He was positioning himself right there, sharing that daily terror, that vulnerability that ordinary Ukrainians were living with. It was a deliberate way to shatter the sense of impunity that the Kremlin elite might have felt.
Right, the idea that they're untouchable. Exactly. The logic is, our people are forced underground by your decisions. So maybe you should think about needing shelters too. Transferring that civilian experience onto the aggressors. That's a powerful psychological move.
And the language used, it was so pointed. He didn't just vaguely promise revenge.
No, absolutely not. And the sources really emphasize this nuance. Zelensky was apparently very careful to preface it all by saying, quite explicitly, that Ukrainians are not terrorists.
Okay.
That they don't need to attack civilians. So he's framing any potential retaliation not as indiscriminate terror, which, let's be clear, is often Russia's tactic, but as targeted justice.
Aimed at those responsible.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Aimed at those culpable for the war crimes. It establishes this clear moral justification before making the threat, which is really important, especially when you think about his Western audience.
And that moral argument was kind of anchored in the immediate grief, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Referencing the damaged swing sets, the kids who will never speak again. It just yanks the conflict out of abstract geopolitics.
Right.
And makes it feel like a very personal reckoning for the people making decisions in Moscow.
It creates this almost symmetrical psychological weight. The logic is, if you okay strikes that put our children in shelters, well, your own safety isn't guaranteed anymore. But that raises a really interesting question, doesn't it? If the main goal is targeted justice, why deliver the message in a way that, could risk escalating things further? Maybe even alienating some of those Western partners Kyiv depends on.
Yeah, that's the tightrope walk. The sources suggest this whole thing didn't just happen randomly. It came at a moment of really intense pressure, specifically in the spring of 2025.
Exactly. You have to understand the context. By then, the war was grinding into its 4th year, just relentless attrition. Russia controlled, about 19–20% of Ukrainian territory? And crucially, they'd ramped up these massive missile and drone attacks, hitting civilian infrastructure, trying to terrorize people.
And the Kryvyi Rih strike was just the latest brutal example of that.
It demanded some kind of response.
But even with all that pressure land, Ukraine had shown it could hit back in unexpected ways, right? Which made this threat seem, credible.
That's a vital point. You absolutely have to look at the successes against the Black Sea Fleet. Ukraine had managed somehow to inflict really devastating losses, destroying or disabling maybe up to a third of Russia's ships there.
Which forced them out of Sevastopol, their main base.
Right. It forced a major relocation. So what that meant militarily was when Zelensky issued a threat like this, Moscow knew Kyiv had proven capabilities, drones, maybe other long-range assets, to actually strike deep inside Russia or hit sensitive targets. It wasn't just talk.
Okay, so that's the military backdrop. Then you layer on this huge political shift. The Trump administration's gambit. A new president inaugurated in January 2025, and suddenly the policy focus is all on getting a quick, negotiated end to the war. Almost regardless of Kyiv's own goals, why call it a gambit?
Well, it was a gambit because the U.S. was reportedly tying crucial military and financial aid directly to Ukraine, accepting territorial compromise. That's a high-risk strategy, a real break from the previous administration's approach.
Putting massive pressure on Kyiv.
Immense pressure. And our sources point to this incredibly tense meeting on February 28th, 2025. That seems to have been a key confrontation.
And the sources name names. President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance were reportedly in that meeting. What's the significance of Vance being mentioned there?
His reported presence is kind of symbolic of that harder line shift, wouldn't you say?
Mm-hmm.
Vance often represented a more America first or even isolationist view on these foreign conflicts. His involvement would underscore the new administration's direction. Basically, impatience with this open-ended war and a real push for settlement now.
And the report suggested they really laid into Zelensky.
Yeah, the reports indicated they accused him of being ungrateful, even gambling with World War III. It was a very direct signal that the days of unconditional support were over.
Wow. And all this pressure led up to an actual proposed deal in April 2025.
Yes. The U.S. presented what got called a final offer peace settlement. The exact details weren't public, of course, but the leaks suggested it involved Ukraine accepting some, perhaps significant, territorial losses.
In exchange for what? Security guarantees?
Some kind of security arrangements, yes. But here's the really transactional part, the core of the gambit framing. Reports suggested it also involved giving U.S. firms preferential access to Ukraine's huge reserves of critical minerals.
So framing the deal in commercial terms, not just security.
Exactly. Which, understandably, was deeply unsettling for Kyiv.
Okay, so putting it all together, the bomb shelter ultimatum starts to look like Ukraine trying to punch its way out of this strategic vice.
Mm-hmm.
A public declaration that Kyiv wouldn't just passively accept whatever terms the U.S. negotiated, that it would remain an active, defiant player connecting any idea of peace to justice.
Absolutely. It was like drawing a red line in public, saying unequivocally, any deal that lets Russian officials off the hook, gives them amnesty or impunity, that's a non-starter, dead on arrival.
This message clearly had layers. The source material points to three distinct audiences. Let's break those down. Audience number one, the Kremlin elite. What was the strategic goal there beyond just, psychological disruption?
Well, the core intent was deterrence through the threat of retaliation, instilling a genuine sense of personal risk, personal vulnerability.
Making it feel real for them.
Right. But strategically, it also seemed aimed at driving a wedge internally within the Russian system by suggesting that, hey, continuing to support this war effort could actually come at a steep personal cost for you. Zelensky was challenging that narrative the Kremlin pushed, that this was a successful, low-risk, special military operation.
Trying to raise the perceived cost of loyalty for those decision makers.
Exactly. Elevate the personal risk profile.
Okay, from the elite in Moscow, let's shift to the home front in Ukraine. What did this message mean for Ukrainians themselves, dealing with daily attacks? Target number two, the Ukrainian people.
Oh, for them, this was hugely important, for morale, for political unity. It projected this image of a strong, defiant leader, someone promising that the enemy's crimes wouldn't just be forgotten, wouldn't go unpunished.
A promise of eventual justice.
Yes, and after years of brutal war, that served as a really vital public statement that Kyiv wasn't going to be pushed into some humiliating peace deal. It gave voice to that intense feeling, that 100% hatred mentioned in sources, felt by so many who'd lost everything.
A validation of their suffering and anger.
And a powerful reaffirmation of their own agency in this fight.
Okay, and finally, target number three. Western partners, especially the United States. The sources suggest this was maybe the trickiest signal, but strategically crucial. Let's unpack the argument being made there.
Right, this is where the strategic calculus gets really complex. The message to the West, particularly Washington, was essentially an implicit but quite coercive ultimatum.
Which was?
It was basically, look, if you deny us the conventional tools we need to actually win this thing and deter future attacks, specifically things like long-range missiles, Taurus, 8-TACMS, then we will be forced to find other ways that might be more escalatory and maybe less controllable from your perspective.
What kind of other ways were hinted at? Was it just about hitting targets inside Russia?
Well, they already had some limited capacity for that. The implication, according to the analysis, went further. It hinted at Ukraine potentially developing its own indigenous long-range capabilities, specifically designed for high-value targets.
Bypassing Western restrictions entirely.
Exactly. Which you can imagine is a nightmare scenario for Washington, which always wants to control the escalation ladder very carefully.
So the argument is, By denying certain weapons to manage escalation, the West might actually be pushing Kyiv towards options they can't manage, potentially increasing instability.
That's the paradox, yes. You deny the long-range conventional tools, you might inadvertently incentivize Kyiv to develop unconventional means that operate outside Western influence.
So it puts the moral and strategic ball back in Washington's court.
Pretty much, it says. Either give us the means to pursue victory and justice conventionally, or we'll be forced down a path that's far less predictable for everyone.
And it reinforces that core moral framing, again, the civilization versus barbarism narrative, making it politically harder for Western leaders to push a peace deal that seems to prioritize, say, expediency or mineral deals over accountability for atrocities.
Absolutely. It boxed them in, morally.
So this shift in tone from asking for help to almost dictating terms, and it must have caused ripples globally. How did the world react? And what did those reactions tell us about the strains within the Western alliance?
Well, maybe the most telling reaction was actually Russia's non-reaction, at least at a high level.
Strategic silence.
Kind of. The Kremlin didn't offer any direct top-level response to the threat itself. Their public messaging was just classic deflection. Accuse Ukraine of avoiding peace talks, question Zelensky's legitimacy, blame the West for everything.
Standard playbook.
Right, but that lack of direct engagement with the threat suggests it probably hit a nerve. It created a dilemma for Moscow. If you acknowledge the threat, you kind of validate it. If you ignore it, you risk looking weak or inviting Ukraine to test your resolve.
Interesting. And what about within the Western coalition? Sounds like the reactions really highlighted the different approaches to risk. Let's start with the U.S. under the Trump administration.
Yeah, the U.S. reportedly viewed this kind of rhetoric with definite unease, trepidation. Their focus was laser-like on brokering that peace deal they'd proposed. So they expressed clear impatience with both sides for any kind of escalating language. Zelensky's threat was seen as just an unhelpful complication to their transactional goals. They wanted de-escalation, period.
Okay, contrast that with the U.K. London seemed consistently more aligned with Kyiv's perspective.
That alignment really held. The UK offered basically unequivocal support. They strongly condemned Russia's targeting of civilians and seemed to align very closely with Kyiv's demands for justice. You have to remember, there's generally a stronger domestic consensus in the UK about confronting Russian aggression, which perhaps allows for more moral clarity and, frankly, more risk acceptance than some other allies.
Right. Which brings us to key European players like Germany and France. They seem to be walking more of a tightrope.
That's a good way to put it. Germany and France expressed caution, as they often did. While they were providing really essential aid, especially things like advanced air defense systems, which were crucial, they consistently hesitated on supplying certain offensive capabilities.
Like the Taurus missiles from Germany.
Exactly.
Right.
Germany, in particular, kept delaying the Taurus decision. This reflects deep-seated political anxieties at home about being seen as directly escalating the war. Just a lower political tolerance for that kind of risk compared to, say, London or Washington at times.
So Zelensky's statement kind of threw those existing cracks in the European strategy into sharper relief.
It absolutely did. It forced everyone to confront their own red lines and risk calculations.
So this rhetorical shift really does feel like a significant pivot point. The source material sees it as Ukraine signaling, quite definitively, a move away from just asking for help towards actively trying to shape the terms of engagement militarily and diplomatically.
I think that's right. And the key takeaway here, especially for anyone trying to understand Western policy dilemmas, is that really complex calculus it creates. Trying to manage escalation by withholding certain weapons, like long-range missiles, it might paradoxically just push Kyiv to develop its own means of retaliation, means that are potentially less predictable, less controllable.
So the West's desire for stability could, ironically, undermine its ability to ensure justice or even stability itself in the long run.
It's a profound dilemma.
Which leads us to the final provocative thought here. This statement fundamentally personalizes the end game, doesn't it? It strongly suggests the war for Ukraine doesn't truly end just when the shooting stops. It ends when the individuals responsible for the atrocities are actually held accountable. Now, historically, peace deals often involve messy compromises. Sometimes stability means trading away, full accountability, maybe offering amnesty to get the fighting to cease.
And that is the ultimate challenge raised by this kind of rhetoric. The visceral demand for justice embedded in Zelensky's ultimatum makes any negotiated settlement that includes amnesty or impunity incredibly difficult, maybe politically impossible for Kyiv to ever accept. So the viability of any long-term peace seems to hang entirely on how the world and Ukraine itself navigate that fundamental tension. Can you have lasting peace without individual accountability? Or perhaps is justice actually the only foundation upon which a slayable peace can be built in this case?
A huge question with no easy answers. You've been listening to NationScope podcast, where Jordan and Jamie analyze the stories shaping America and the world. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.